In the dying mining town of Dusk Creek, where winter winds carry more ghosts than hope, a pregnant widow splits wood with the determination of someone who has nothing left to lose. Abigail Carter's calloused hands grip the axe handle as she works from dawn to dusk, her swollen belly a testament to both new life and profound loss. The abandoned general store she calls home offers little comfort, but it's her-earned through sweat and stubbornness, not charity. 2 miles away, Silas McCrae tends his horses in solitude, his empty ranch echoing with memories of sons who never write and dreams that turn to dust. When he finds Abby collapsed in the snow, her pride wars with desperate need. His offer of shelter seems simple, another warm place to birth her child, in exchange for help around the ranch. But what happens when two broken souls discover that healing isn't always a solitary journey? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The axe bit deep into the mesquite log, with a satisfying thunk that echoed off the weathered walls of what had once been Murphy's general store. Abigail Carter paused to wipe her brow with the back of her sleeve, her breath forming small white clouds in the crisp morning air. 6 months along now, and the weight of the child she carried made every swing of the axe a deliberate act of will. But will was something she'd never lacked, even when everything else had been stripped away. The deed to this ramshackle building sat folded in her coat pocket, creased from handling and stained with tears she'd shed only once the day she'd signed it, with the last of her savings. $23.16 for a building most folks wouldn't use to shelter their livestock. But it was hers, bought and paid for, and that meant something in a world that had taken her husband, her home, and nearly her life. Dusk Creek had been dying long before the fever came through. The silver mines played out 2 years back, and most sensible folks had packed up and headed for places with more promise. What remained was a collection of empty buildings, a handful of stubborn old-timers, and the kind of silence that settled heavy on a person's shoulders. Abby had arrived here in late summer, drawn by the cheap land and the blessed anonymity of a place where nobody asked too many questions about a woman alone with a swelling belly and shadows under her eyes. She split another log, then another, building the rhythm that had become her daily meditation. The work kept her warm, kept her fed when she sold the excess wood to the few remaining residents, and kept her mind from wandering to places too dark to dwell. Thomas would have hated seeing her like this, hands rough as leather, back aching from labor he'd never wanted her to do, even when she wasn't carrying. But Thomas wasn't here to object, and the baby growing inside her needed shelter and warmth more than it needed a mother with soft hands. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. From her position behind the store, Abby could see most of what remained of the town. The old saloon with its broken windows, the church with its bell tower listing to one side, the row of houses where families had once raised children and planned futures that never came to pass. Sometimes she wondered if the ghosts of those abandoned dreams were what made the wind sound so mournful when it swept down from the mountains. 2 miles up the winding trail that led into the foothills, Silas McCrae stood in his barn, running practiced hands along the flank of a chestnut mare. At 58, his body still carried the strength of decades spent working with horses, though his joints reminded him each morning that those decades had taken their toll. The mare nickered softly at his touch, and he murmured to her in the gentle tones he reserved for animal screeches that didn't judge or disappoint or leave you wondering where you went wrong. The Double S Ranch had been in his family for 32 years, carved out of difficult ground through backbreaking work and stubborn determination. His late wife Sarah had named it, laughing that it stood for both Silas and Sarah and stubborn souls, a description that had fit them both. In the good years, they'd run cattle and bred horses, raised 2 boys who'd learned to ride before they could properly walk, and built something that felt permanent in an uncertain world. Now the cattle were gone, sold off after the boys left, and the work became too much for one man alone. The horses remained 8 good mares and a stallion that still had fire in his eyes, because horses had always been Silas's first love, even before Sarah had stolen his heart at a church social 34 years ago. The boys, Michael and David, 26 and 24 now, if his calculations were right, though he hadn't seen either of them for 3 years. They'd left after the arguments, after the bitter words about tradition and progress, and whether a man had the right to expect his sons to want the life he'd built for them. Michael had gone to San Francisco to work in his uncle's shipping business. David had headed to Denver with dreams of making his fortune in banking. Neither had written more than twice, and those letters had been formal things, empty of affection or any real news. Silas finished checking the mare's hooves and moved to the next stall. The silence of the ranch had become both companion and burden. Some days it felt peaceful, like a well-earned rest after decades of noise and chaos. Other days it pressed against him like a weight, making him understand why some men took to drink or wandering just to escape the echo of their own thoughts. He'd been making his weekly trip to town for supplies when he first noticed the woman behind Murphy's old store. That had been near 2 months ago now, and he'd watched her from a distance, curious despite himself about what would bring a pregnant woman to a dying place like Dusk Creek. She worked with a determination that reminded him of Sarah in her younger days, back when they'd been building their life from nothing but hope and hard work. The woman he'd learned her name was Abigail from old Pete, who ran the boarding house and never seemed to rest. Every time Silas rode through town, she was out there with that axe, splitting wood with mechanical precision. He'd considered approaching her, offering help, or at least conversation, but something about the set of her shoulders warned him off. She had the look of someone who'd learned not to trust kindness, and Silas understood that particular brand of wariness. Back in town, Abby paused in her work to stretch her back and survey her progress. The pile of split wood had grown satisfyingly large, enough to keep her through another week if she was careful with the stove. The baby shifted inside her, a reminder that her time for this kind of work was growing short. Dr. Henley over in Millfield had told her the child would come in early spring, assuming she could make the 15-mile journey when her time came. The assumption had been that she'd have help, family or friends to see her through. He hadn't quite known what to make of her explanation that she'd be managing on her own. She'd been managing on her own since the fever took Thomas last spring. The disease had swept through their small farm community like wildfire, taking the weak and the strong with equal indifference. Thomas had been 31 and healthy as a horse until the fever touched him. 3 days later, she'd buried him in the little cemetery behind the church where they'd been married just 2 years before. The baby had been a surprise, discovered only after Thomas was gone, a final gift from the husband who'd promised her they'd fill their farmhouse with children someday. For a while, in those first terrible weeks of grief, she'd wondered if she had the strength to carry on for 2. But the child had been persistent, growing strong inside her, even as she struggled to hold on to hope, and eventually she'd understood that this baby was her reason to keep fighting. The farm had to be sold to pay Thomas's medical bills, and the debts he'd hidden from her debts she'd never suspected until the bankman came calling with his papers and his apologetic smile. By the time everything was settled, she'd had enough for a train ticket and a handful of coins, not nearly enough to start over in any place that mattered to living people. A sound from the street made her look up hoofbeats, steady and unhurried. A rider was coming down the main street, and from the familiar silhouette, she could tell it was the man she'd glimpsed a few times before. Tall in the saddle, with silver showing in his dark hair and the easy seat of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He'd never spoken to her directly, but she'd caught him watching sometimes, and there'd been something in his expression that wasn't pity or curiosity. More like recognition, as if he understood something about the weight she carried. Silas drew rein in front of the old store, taking in the sight of Abigail Carter and her impressive pile of split wood. Up close, he could see the determination in her face more clearly, but also the weariness she tried to hide. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes were worn but clean. She watched him with the cautious attention of someone who'd learned to read trouble before it arrived. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was rusty from lack of use, but it carried easily in the quiet air. "Morning," she replied, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. She shifted her weight, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on her rounded belly. "You're doing good work there," Silas observed, nodding toward the woodpile. "That's going to keep you warm through the cold spell that's coming." Abby studied his face, trying to read his intentions. Men who offered compliments usually wanted something in return, and she'd learned to be suspicious of kindness from strangers. "I manage well enough," she said. Silas nodded, recognizing the defensive posture. He'd worn it himself often enough in the years since Sarah died. "I'm sure you do," he said. "Just meant to say it's impressive work. I'm Silas McCrae. I run the double S up the trail." "Abigail Carter," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "I know who you are. Seen you in town before." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled by the distant sound of wind moving through the empty buildings. Silas found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the stubborn line of her jaw. There was steel in this woman, the kind that had helped his own wife survive the hard early years of their marriage. "If you ever need anything," he said finally, "the ranch isn't far. Good neighbors look out for each other, even in a place like this." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and without conditions. Abby felt something stir in her chestnut, quite trust, but maybe the possibility of it. She'd been alone so long that the mere suggestion of help felt both tempting and terrifying. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but I've been managing fine on my own." Silas touched his hat brim again, already turning his horse away. "I'm sure you have. Offer stands, though. Good day, Mrs. Carter." As he rode away, Abby watched until he disappeared around the bend in the trail. Then she picked up her axe and returned to her work, but the rhythm felt different now. For the first time in months, the silence didn't seem quite so complete. 3 days after her conversation with Silas McCrae, Abby woke to a world transformed by snow. The storm had moved in during the night, blanketing Dust Creek in a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even her heartbeat. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the old store, and felt the first real stirring of fear she'd allowed herself since arriving here. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her unease. 7 months now, and growing heavier each day. Dr. Henley's words echoed in her mind, words she'd tried not to think about too much. The fever that had taken Thomas had nearly claimed her too, leaving damage the doctor had been reluctant to discuss in detail. All she knew was that this birth would be more dangerous than most, and that she'd need help when the time came. She struggled to her feet, her back protesting after a night on the thin mattress she'd salvaged from one of the abandoned houses. The cold bit through her nightgown as she moved to the window, scraping frost from the glass to peer outside. The snow was already knee-deep and still falling, driven by wind that turned the flakes into stinging needles. The woodpile she'd worked so hard to build was buried under a white mound. More concerning was the fact that she could barely make out the outline of the outhouse through the swirling snow. Getting there and back would be a treacherous journey, and she'd have to make it soon. Abby dressed quickly, pulling on every layer she owned. The doctor's letter was tucked in the drawer beneath her spare chemisette, creased piece of paper that she'd read only once, but whose contents were burned into her memory. The fever had damaged something inside her, something that made carrying this child a risk to them both. Dr. Henley had suggested she not attempt another pregnancy after this one, assuming she survived this one. She'd told him she understood, though she wasn't sure she did. All she knew was that this baby represented her last chance at the family she and Thomas had dreamed of, and she'd fight death itself before she'd let anything happen to the child. The wind seemed to shake the entire building as she made her way to the small kitchen area. The stove was barely warm, the fire having died during the night. She'd need to venture outside for more wood soon, but first she had to get some warmth back into her bones. As she fumbled with kindling, a sharp pain shot through her lower back knot, the familiar ache she'd grown accustomed to, but something sharper, more urgent. She gripped the edge of the table until it passed, telling herself it was just the cold, just the strain of sleeping on an unforgiving mattress. But when the pain came again 10 minutes later, stronger this time, she couldn't deny what her body was trying to tell her. Something was wrong. The next hour passed in a haze of increasing discomfort and growing panic. The pains weren't regular enough to be lab, at least. She didn't think they were, but they were getting stronger. She managed to get a small fire going in the stove, but every movement was becoming an effort. When she tried to venture outside for wood, the wind nearly knocked her down, and she retreated inside with her heart pounding and her hands shaking from more than just cold. By midday, she was lying on her bed, gripping the thin quilt and trying to breathe through pains that came without warning or pattern. The baby had stopped moving, which frightened her more than anything else. She pressed her hands to her belly, willing the child to respond, to give her some sign that everything was all right. The sound of hoofbeats outside seemed like a hallucination at first. No one would be riding in weather like this. But the sound persisted, growing closer, and then she heard a man's voice calling her name through the storm. "Mrs. Carter? Abigail, are you all right in there?" Silas. She tried to call back, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The pain was constant now, a grinding ache that seemed to be squeezing the life out of her. She heard his boots on the wooden steps, then his fist pounding on the door. "Mrs. Carter, I'm coming in." The door opened with a gust of wind and snow, and Silas McCrae stepped inside, shaking ice from his coat. His face was red with cold, but his eyes were alert and concerned as they swept the small space and found her on the bed. "Jesus," he breathed, crossing to her side in 3 quick strides. "How long have you been like this?" Abby tried to answer, but another wave of pain stole her breath. Silas knelt beside the bed, his experienced rancher's eyes taking in her pale face and the way she clutched her belly. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. "Can you ride?" She shook her head weakly. The thought of mounting a horse in her condition seemed impossible, and the nearest doctor was 15 miles away through what was shaping up to be the worst storm of the winter. Silas was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he stood and began moving around the small space with purposeful efficiency. "All right," he said, "we're going to get you to my place. I've got a wagon, and the ranch is only 2 miles. We can make it if we go now." "I can't," Abby started to protest, but he cut her off with a gentle but firm shake of his head. "You can and you will," he said. "Your pride isn't worth your life or that baby's life. We're past the point where you can manage this alone." Something in his voice, not just authority, but genuine concern, broke through her resistance. She'd been holding on to her independence so fiercely that she'd forgotten there might be times when accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. "My things," she whispered. "I'll come back for whatever you need," Silas promised. "Right now, we need to get you warm and safe." He gathered her few possessions quickly, the doctor's letter, her spare clothes, the small bag of coins that represented her entire savings. Then he wrapped her in every blanket he could find and lifted her as carefully as if she were made of spun glass. The journey to his wagon was a nightmare of wind and stinging snow. Abby buried her face against his shoulder, grateful for his strength as he fought through drifts that came up to his knees. The wagon was covered with canvas, and he'd lined it with straw and blankets, creating a nest that offered some protection from the storm. "This is going to be rough," he warned, as he settled her inside. "But the horses know the way home, and we'll be there soon." The ride seemed to last forever. Every jolt of the wagon sent fresh waves of pain through Abby's body, and she found herself gripping Silas's hand without realizing when he'd offered it. He talked to her throughout the journey, his voice steady and reassuring, even when she could barely hear him over the wind. "Almost there," he kept saying. "Just hold on, we're almost there." When they finally reached the double S, Abby was only dimly aware of being carried again, this time into warmth and lamplight, and the blessed relief of a real bed with clean sheets and thick quilts. Silas moved around her with quiet competence, building up the fire, heating water, making her as comfortable as possible. "The baby," she managed to whisper as he tucked the covers around her. "The baby's going to be fine," he said with more confidence than he felt. "You're both going to be fine." I've helped deliver more foals than I can count, and I helped Sarah through both our boys' births. I know what I'm doing." She wanted to argue, to point out that horses and people weren't the same thing, but the warmth of the bed and the exhaustion of the day were pulling her toward sleep. For the first time in months, she felt safe, truly safe, and the feeling was so foreign it brought tears to her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, adjusting the lamp on the bedside table. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and loss. "Because sometimes we get so focused on proving we can handle everything alone that we forget there's strength in accepting help when we need it," he said. "I learned that lesson too late with my own boys. Maybe it's not too late for you." As sleep finally claimed her, Abby's last conscious thought was that for the first time since Thomas died, she wasn't facing her fears alone. The storm could rage all it wanted outside. She was warm, she was safe, and someone was watching over her and her unborn child. In the kitchen, Silas sat at his table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, listening to the wind and thinking about the woman sleeping in his guest room. He'd acted on instinct when he'd ridden into town, something telling him to check on the stubborn woman who'd been occupying his thoughts more than he cared to admit. Finding her in distress had confirmed what he'd suspected: she was in no condition to face the challenges ahead alone. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. The storm showed no signs of letting up, which meant they'd be trapped together until it passed. And then there would be the delicate matter of figuring out what came next. But tonight it was enough that she was safe and warm, and that the terrible isolation that had defined both their lives had been broken, if only temporarily. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside the Double S Ranch, two people who had grown accustomed to facing the world alone were learning that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. Abby woke to the smell of bacon frying and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the room too warm, the silence too peaceful. Then memory returned. The storm, the pain, Silas McCrae carrying her through the snow like she weighed nothing at all. Morning light filtered through curtains she hadn't noticed the night before, revealing a room that was clearly masculine but comfortable. The furniture was solid oak, well made, but showing the wear of years of use. A washstand stood in one corner, complete with a blue ceramic pitcher and basin. On the dresser, a small framed photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sarah, she presumed, Silas's late wife. The baby shifted inside her, a reassuring movement that eased some of the fear that had gripped her yesterday. The sharp pains were gone, replaced by the familiar ache she'd grown accustomed to. Whatever crisis had overtaken her seemed to have passed, at least for now. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Carter? You awake in there?" "Yes," she called, then cleared her throat and tried again, stronger. "Yes, I'm awake. I've got breakfast ready if you're feeling up to it. Nothing fancy, but it's hot." Abby struggled to sit up, her body protesting after the ordeal of yesterday. She was still wearing the clothes Silas had bundled her into for the journey, and she felt rumpled and self-conscious. But the smell of food was making her stomach growl, reminding her that she'd barely eaten anything yesterday. "I'll be right there," she called. It took her several minutes to make herself presentable. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. She finger-combed it as best she could and twisted it back into a simple knot, wishing she had a mirror to check her appearance. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Silas standing at the stove, turning strips of bacon with practiced ease. He glanced over his shoulder as she appeared, and she caught a flicker of relief in his expression. "You look better," he said simply. "Color's back in your cheeks." The kitchen was larger than her entire living space at the store, with a big oak table that could seat six and cupboards that suggested this had once been a home where meals were shared with family. A pot of coffee sat on the back of the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. "Sit," Silas commanded gently, pulling out a chair for her. "No arguments. You're eating a proper breakfast if I have to tie you to that chair." Despite everything, Abby found herself almost smiling at his gruff concern. She settled into the offered chair, noting how carefully he'd arranged everything, a plate, napkin, and utensils set precisely at her place, a glass of what looked like fresh milk beside it. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," she said. "No trouble," Silas replied, sliding eggs from the pan onto her plate alongside the bacon. "Been cooking for myself for 3 years now. Nice to have someone to cook for besides the horses." He served himself and sat across from her, and for a few minutes they ate in comfortable silence. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, and Abby realized she hadn't tasted anything this good since leaving her farm. She found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. "Storms passed," Silas observed, nodding toward the window. "Still plenty of snow on the ground, but the winds died down. Roads won't be passable for a few days, though." Abby paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. She'd been so focused on the immediate comfort of warmth and food that she hadn't considered the practical implications of her situation. "I should get back to town as soon as possible," she said. "I don't want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Silas set down his coffee cup and studied her with those steady grey eyes. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" he asked. "That store of yours doesn't have proper heating, and after what happened yesterday, you've got no business being alone, storm or no storm." The reasonable tone of his voice made it hard to argue, but Abby's instincts rebelled against the idea of dependence. "I managed fine before yesterday," she said. "Did you?" Silas's voice was gentle but firm. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you were one bad day away from disaster. What if I hadn't come to check on you? What if the baby had decided to come early in the middle of that storm?" The questions hung in the air between them, and Abby found she didn't have good answers. She'd been so focused on maintaining her independence that she hadn't fully considered the risks she was taking, not just with her own life, but with her child's. "I can't stay here," she said finally. "It wouldn't be proper. People would talk." Silas actually laughed, a rusty sound that suggested he didn't do it often. "People? What people? There's maybe a dozen souls left in Dusk Creek, and half of them are too old to care about propriety. Besides," his expression grew more serious, "seems to me your baby's welfare is more important than what a handful of strangers might think." After breakfast, Silas showed her around the ranch house, and Abby began to understand the scope of what he'd built here. The house was large and well constructed, with 4 bedrooms and a parlor that spoke of better days when it had been filled with family. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the life he'd shared with Sarah: photographs, handmade curtains, a rocking chair by the fireplace that looked like it had been used to comfort crying babies. "Sarah made those," Silas said, noticing her looking at the curtains. "Had a talent for making things beautiful. Used to say a house wasn't a home without a woman's touch." They moved to the barn, where Abby got her first real look at the horses that were clearly Silas's pride and joy. 8 mares and a stallion, all of them sleek and well cared for despite the harsh winter. The animals nickered softly as Silas moved among them, checking feed and water with the automatic competence of long practice. In one of the stalls, Abby noticed a small wooden horse, carved with obvious care and polished smooth by handling. It was clearly a child's toy, though it had been set carefully on a feed bucket, as if it was something precious. "That belonged to David," Silas said, following her gaze. "My younger boy. He used to carry it everywhere when he was little, said it was his horse's baby." His voice carried a note of wistfulness that made Abby's heart ache for him. "Where are your sons now?" she asked gently. Silas was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along the neck of the mare in the nearest stall. "Gone," he said finally. "Both of them. Decided the ranch life wasn't for them after all. Can't say I blame them exactly. It's a hard life, and there's not much future in it for young men with ambition." But there was pain in his voice that suggested the leaving hadn't been entirely amicable, and Abby sensed there were depths to the story that he wasn't ready to share. As they walked back to the house, she found herself studying him more carefully than she had before. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own space, but there was a loneliness about him that reminded her of her own. He'd lost his wife and his sons in different ways, and now he rattled around in a house meant for a family, taking care of horses that were probably more companion than livestock. "Why did you really come to check on me yesterday?" she asked as they reached the porch. Silas paused with his hand on the door, considering the question. "Instinct, I guess," he said. "Something about that storm didn't sit right with me, and I kept thinking about you in that drafty old store. Sarah used to say I had a sense about these things when people needed help, even if they were too proud to ask for it." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife in a way that suggested he still talked to her memory, and Abby felt a sudden rush of understanding. She wasn't the only one who still carried on conversations with someone who was gone. That afternoon, as she rested in the comfortable chair by the parlor fire, Abby found herself studying the photographs that filled the mantelpiece. Pictures of Silas and Sarah as a young couple, their faces bright with hope and plans. Pictures of two dark-haired boys at various ages fishing, riding horses, grinning at the camera with the careless confidence of children who believed the world would always be kind to them. "They were beautiful boys," she said when Silas brought her a cup of tea. "They were," he agreed, settling into the chair across from her. "Full of life and energy, this house used to ring with their laughter. Now," he gestured around the quiet room, "well, now it's peaceful, I suppose." But there was a world of loss in that word, peaceful, and Abby understood that his quiet was as much burden as blessing, just as hers had been. As evening approached and they shared another simple meal, Abby found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. There was something healing about sitting across from another person, sharing food and quiet conversation. She'd forgotten how lonely she'd been until the loneliness began to lift. "Tomorrow I'll hitch up the wagon and take you back to town to collect your things," Silas said as they finished eating. "Whatever you need, we'll bring it back here." "Silas, I can't," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "You can and you will," he said firmly, "at least until after the baby comes. I've got plenty of room, and it'll be good to have someone to cook for besides myself. Consider it a business arrangement if it makes you feel better. You help around the house. I provide room and board." Abby studied his face, looking for signs of pity or charity, but found only practical concern and perhaps a loneliness that matched her own. "Just until the baby comes," she said finally. "Just until the baby comes," he agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he was hoping it might be longer than that. The wagon ride back to Dusk Creek, 2 days later, gave Abby her first real look at the land between the ranch and town. In daylight, with the storm past and the snow sparkling under winter sun, the country revealed a stark beauty she hadn't appreciated before. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, and the silence wasn't oppressive, but peaceful, the kind of quiet that let a person hear their own thoughts without the constant noise of other people's lives pressing in. Silas handled the horses with easy competence, and she found herself studying his profile as he drove. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and silver threads ran through his dark hair. But he carried himself with the strength of a man who'd spent his life doing physical work. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, scarred from decades of ranch work, but gentle when they needed to be. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, catching her looking at him. Abby felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away toward the snow-covered landscape. "Just thinking about how different everything looks in the daylight," she said. "It's beautiful country, in its own way." "Sarah used to say that," Silas replied. "She loved the wide spaces, the way you could see for miles in every direction. Said it made her feel like she could breathe properly." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "Took me years to see it through her eyes, but once I did, I understood what she meant." They were comfortable silences now, these pauses in their conversation. Abby had noticed that Silas wasn't a man who felt compelled to fill every quiet moment with words, and she appreciated that about him. Thomas had been a talker, always ready with a story or an opinion, and while she'd loved that about him, there was something restful about Silas's more measured approach to conversation. When they reached her makeshift home behind Murphy's store, the contrast between it and the double S was stark. The building looked even more ramshackle than she remembered, and she wondered how she'd convinced herself it was adequate shelter for a woman expecting a baby. "Take whatever you need," Silas said as he helped her down from the wagon. "No point leaving anything behind that might be useful." Abby gathered her few possessions: clothes, books, the small wooden box that held her most precious keepsakes, including her wedding ring. She'd stopped wearing it a few weeks ago when her fingers began to swell, but she couldn't bring herself to put it away entirely. It sat now in the box alongside a lock of Thomas's hair and the letter he'd written her on their first anniversary, promising her a lifetime of love and adventure. As she packed, Silas made his own assessment of the place, his expression growing more grim as he took in the thin walls, the inadequate heating, the generally poor condition of everything. "You were planning to have the baby here?" he asked, not hiding his concern. "I was managing," Abby said, but even to her own ears it sounded weak. "Managing to get yourself and that child killed," Silas replied bluntly. "Christ, Abby, this place isn't fit for livestock, let alone a woman in your condition." The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. It was the first time he'd used it, and somehow it felt like crossing a bridge between them from strangers, offering mutual assistance, to something that might actually be friendship. They loaded her belongings into the wagon, and Abby took one last look around the place that had been her refuge for the past few months. It hadn't been much, but it had been hers, and leaving it felt like another small surrender of the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. "Second thoughts?" Silas asked, noting her hesitation. "No," Abby said firmly. "No second thoughts, just saying goodbye, I suppose." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but as they approached the house, Abby felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of homecoming. The building looked solid and welcoming against the snowy landscape, smoke rising from the chimney in a straight line against the clear sky. That evening, as they settled into what was becoming their routine, Silas reading a book by the fire while Abby worked on mending some of his shirts that had seen better day, she broke the comfortable silence with a question. "Tell me about your husband," he said, "if you don't mind talking about him." Abby's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. She'd grown so accustomed to keeping her grief private that the invitation to share it felt both welcome and terrifying. "Thomas was. He was a good man," she said finally, "kind, hard-working, full of dreams about the life we were going to build together. He was a farmer, like his father before him, but he had ideas about new techniques, better ways of doing things. He used to say we were going to have the most productive farm in the county." "How long were you married?" 2 years, Abby replied, her voice soft with memory. "Not nearly long enough. We met at a church social. He asked me to dance, and I said yes, even though I was terrible at dancing. He didn't seem to mind. Said I was the prettiest girl there, though I knew that wasn't true." Silas looked up from his book, studying her face in the firelight. "I imagine it was true to him," he said gently. Abby felt tears prick at her eyes knot, the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but something softer, warmer. "He wanted children right away," she continued. "Used to talk about filling our house with the sound of little feet, teaching his sons to farm and his daughters to be strong, independent women. When I found out about the baby after he was gone..." She paused, touching her belly. "It felt like a gift and a curse at the same time. A piece of him I could keep, but also a reminder of everything we'd lost." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. Then Silas set aside his book and leaned forward slightly. "Sarah and I were married for 28 years, he said. "Met her when she was just 18, fresh from back east and staying with her aunt in town. I was 24 and convinced I was going to be a bachelor forever. Took one look at her and knew I was wrong." "What was she like?" Abby asked. A smile played at the corners of Silas's mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as smart," he said. "City-raised, but she took to ranch life like she'd been born to it. Never complained about the hard work or the isolation, just rolled up her sleeves and made this place into a home. She had a way of making everything better just by being there. You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Silas admitted. But I've learned there's a difference between missing someone and letting that missing consume you. Sarah wouldn't have wanted me to stop living just because she was gone. Abby considered this, recognizing the wisdom in his words. She'd been so afraid of dishonoring Thomas's memory by moving forward that she'd forgotten he would have wanted her to find happiness again. The baby kicks a lot at night, she said, changing the subject to something less emotionally charged. I think it's going to be an active child. That's a good sign, Silas replied. Means it's strong and healthy. Have you thought about names? Abby hesitated. She'd avoided thinking too much about the future, too afraid of making plans that might not come to pass. If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Thomas, she said, after his father. If it's a girl, she paused, realizing she'd never seriously considered the possibility. I don't know. I haven't let myself think that far ahead. Sarah always said girls need strong names, Silas observed. Names that will serve them well, whether they choose to be gentle or fierce. As they prepared for bed that night, Abby found herself looking forward to the evening conversations that were becoming the highlight of her days. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing thoughts and memories with someone who listened without judgment, who offered his own experiences without trying to minimize hers. In her room, she'd begun thinking of it as her room rather than the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed and carefully removed her wedding ring from the wooden box. The gold band caught the lamplight, and for the first time since Thomas's death, looking at it didn't fill her with overwhelming grief. She slipped it onto her right hand, where it fit more comfortably now that the swelling in her left hand had made wearing it impossible. It felt different there still, a connection to the love she'd shared with Thomas, but not a chain binding her to the past. Through the thin walls, she could hear Silas moving around his own room, the familiar sounds of someone preparing for sleep. The knowledge that she wasn't alone in the house, that someone was there who cared about her welfare, brought a peace she hadn't felt since before Thomas got sick. The baby shifted inside her, settling into what seemed like a more comfortable position, and for the first time in months, Abby allowed herself to imagine a future that might hold more than just survival. Maybe it would be possible to build something new here, something that honored the past while embracing the possibility of happiness. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwoods Silas had planted years ago, and the sound was gentle rather than mournful. Winter was still far from over, but spring would come eventually, and with it, new life and new beginnings. As sleep claimed her, Abby's last conscious thought was that she felt safer and more hopeful than she had in a very long time. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them entirely alone. 2 weeks into February, Abby discovered the bundle of letters while cleaning Silas's desk. She hadn't meant to pry. She'd simply been dusting the surfaces in the parlor as part of her self-appointed household duties when she'd noticed the drawer was slightly ajar. When she went to close it properly, the corner of an envelope caught her eye. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, and she could see they were addressed to Silas in 2 different hands. The postmarks were from San Francisco and Denver, dating back over the past 3 years. Her heart clenched as she realized what they must be correspondence from his sons that he'd never opened. She closed the drawer quickly, but the knowledge sat heavy in her chest for the rest of the day. At dinner that evening, she found herself studying Silas's face, noting the lines of weariness that seemed deeper than they should be for a man his age. He was telling her about plans for spring planting, his voice steady and practical, but she could see the loneliness that lurked beneath his capable exterior. "Silas," she said carefully, setting down her fork, "can I ask you something personal?" He paused in cutting his meat, his grey eyes meeting hers across the table. "I suppose that depends on how personal," he said. But there was no defensiveness in his tone, just mild curiosity. "Your sons, when was the last time you heard from them?" The question hung in the air between them, and Abby watched as Silas's expression closed off slightly. He resumed cutting his meat with deliberate precision. "It's been a while," he said finally. "But they do write." Silas set down his knife and fork, his hands resting flat on the table. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, but then he sighed deeply. "They write," he admitted. I don't read the letters." Abby felt her heart break a little for this proud man, who was so afraid of further rejection that he couldn't bring himself to open communications from his own children. "Why?" she asked gently. Silas was quiet for a long time, staring down at his plate. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Because I'm afraid of what they might say," he said, "or what they might not say. When they left, there were harsh words. Things said on both sides that probably shouldn't have been. I kept thinking they'd come back, that they'd realize this was their home and their heritage. But as the months turned into years," he trailed off, but Abby understood. The longer the silence stretched, the harder it became to break it, until the fear of disappointment outweighed the hope of reconciliation. "What if they're trying to reach out?" she asked. "What if they want to mend things, but don't know how?" Silas looked up at her then, and she saw a vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept hidden. "What if they're not?" he countered. "What if they're just writing out of obligation, or to tell me they're getting married and don't want me there? What if they've built lives that don't include me at all?" Abby reached across the table and covered one of his hands with hers the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them. His skin was warm and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked hard his entire life. "What if they haven't?" she asked. "What if they miss you as much as you miss them? You'll never know unless you're brave enough to find out." They sat like that for a moment, her hand on his, both of them thinking about the courage it took to risk disappointment for the possibility of connection. Finally, Silas turned his hand palm up and squeezed her fingers gently. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "I think wisdom comes from making enough mistakes to recognize them when you see other people about to make them," Abby replied. "I spent so much time after Thomas died being afraid to hope for anything that I almost forgot how to hope at all. I don't want to see you make the same mistake." The next morning, Abby woke to find Silas already gone from the house. From her bedroom window, she could see him in the barn, moving among the horses with his usual competence. But there was something different about his postury attention that hadn't been there the day before. When he came in for breakfast, he was carrying one of the letters. It lay unopened beside his plate as they ate, like a snake that might strike if disturbed. Abby said nothing about it, but she found herself glancing at it repeatedly, wondering what news it contained. "Michael always had good handwriting," Silas said suddenly, noticing her attention. "Sarah used to make both boys practice their letters every evening after supper. Said a man who couldn't express himself clearly in writing was at a disadvantage in the world." "She sounds like a wise woman," Abby said. She was. Silas picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands. She would have opened these the day they arrived, would have read them aloud at the dinner table and insisted we write back immediately. "But she's not here," Abby said gently. "You have to decide for yourself what's right." Silas nodded slowly, then, with sudden decision, broke the seal on the envelope. His hands were steady as he unfolded the pages, but Abby could see the muscle in his jaw ticking as he read. She busied herself with clearing the breakfast dishes, giving him privacy while staying close enough to offer support if he needed it. When she glanced back at him, she was surprised to see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. He was reading slowly, as if savoring every word, and his expression had transformed from apprehension to something that looked almost like wonder. "He's getting married," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Michael's getting married to a girl named Catherine, he says." Silas paused, reading directly from the letter. "He says he wishes I could meet her, that she reminds him of Mother in some ways, strong and kind, with a good laugh." Abby felt tears prick her own eyes at the joy and pain mingled in Silas's voice. "He wants me to come to San Francisco for the wedding," Silas continued. "Says it wouldn't be the same without his father there, and Silas's voice broke slightly. "He apologizes for the things he said when he left, says he was young and angry and didn't understand what it meant to leave family behind." Abby abandoned the dishes and came to sit beside him at the table. Without thinking, she put her arm around his shoulders, offering the comfort of human contact in a moment when words weren't enough. "There's more," Silas said, leaning into her touch. David's been promoted at the bank. He's doing well, but he says he misses the ranch sometimes, misses the smell of hay and the sound of horses. He asks about the mares, whether Thunder's still siring good foals. They love you, Abby said simply. Whatever happened when they left, they love you and they miss you. Silas set the letter down carefully, as if it were made of precious metal rather than paper. I need to write back, he said. I need to tell them. God, I don't even know where to start. Start with the truth, Abby suggested. Tell them you miss them. Tell them you're proud of what they've accomplished. Tell them you love them. Over the next hour, Abby helped Silas compose responses to both letters. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with care. He told Michael he would be honored to attend the wedding, that he looked forward to meeting Catherine. He told David about the ranch, about the new foals expected in spring, about how quiet the house had become without his son's laughter echoing through the rooms. Most importantly, he told them both that he was sorry for the harsh words, sorry for being too stubborn to reach out sooner, sorry for letting pride keep him from the sons he loved more than his own life. Sarah would be proud of you, Abby said as Silas sealed the letters, preparing to ride to town to post them. She would have done this years ago, Silas replied. She never let pride get in the way of love. That evening, there was a lightness in Silas that Abby hadn't seen before. He moved around the house with more energy, hummed absently while doing chores, and actually smiled when he caught her watching him. You did a good thing today, she told him as they sat by the fire after dinner. We did a good thing, he corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. Seems like you have a talent for helping people face the things they're afraid of. Abby considered this, thinking about her own fears, the fear of depending on someone else, the fear of caring too much, the fear that accepting help somehow diminished her. Maybe we help each other, she said. Maybe that's what people do when they care about each other. They help each other be braver than they could be alone. As if summoned by her words, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, making Abby gasp and press her hand to her belly. Silas looked up in concern. Everything all right? Fine, Abby said, laughing. I think someone's just reminding us they're here. This little one's been particularly active today. May I? Silas asked, gesturing toward her belly. Abby hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Silas moved to kneel beside her chair, placing his large hand gently on the curve of her stomach. As if responding to his touch, the baby kicked again, strong enough that Silas's eyes widened in amazement. Lord, he breathed, that's a strong one. Feels like this child's going to be a force to be reckoned with. Just like its mother, he added, meeting her eyes with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. They stayed like that for several minutes. Silas's hand on her belly, both of them marveling at the life growing inside her. It was an intimate moment, more intimate than anything Abby had shared with anyone since Thomas died, and yet it felt natural, right. When Silas finally moved back to his chair, the air between them seemed charged with something new, not just friendship, but the possibility of something deeper. Neither of them spoke about it directly, but as they prepared for bed that night, Abby found herself thinking about the way his touch had felt, the gentleness in his eyes when he'd felt her baby move. She was beginning to care for this man, more than was wise, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. She'd built her life around the idea that she would raise this child alone, that she didn't need anyone else's help or love. But Silas was making her question those assumptions, making her wonder if maybe there was room in her heart for something new without betraying the love she'd shared with Thomas. As she drifted off to sleep, Abby found herself imagining a future that included more than just survival, a future where the child growing inside her might have not just a mother who loved them, but a man who could teach them to ride horses and mend fences and face life's challenges with quiet courage. It was a dangerous hope, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel impossible. March arrived with an unexpected warm spell that turned the snow to slush and filled the air with the promise of spring. Abby had been at the ranch for 6 weeks now, and the routine they'd established felt as natural as breathing. She handled the cooking and lighter household tasks, while Silas managed the outdoor work, and their evenings were spent in comfortable companionship by the fire. The baby was due in little more than a month, and Abby had begun the practical work of preparing for its arrival. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, while Silas worked in the barn, she'd taken to knitting, something she hadn't done since her grandmother taught her as a child. Her first attempts had been clumsy, full of dropped stitches and uneven tension, but gradually her hands remembered the rhythm. The baby blanket was taking shape now, soft yellow wool that would suit either a boy or a girl. Each stitch was a small act of hope, a tangible preparation for the future that felt more real with every passing day. As she worked, she found herself thinking not just about the child she would soon hold, but about the life they might build together in this place that was beginning to feel like home. "That's coming along nicely," Silas said one afternoon, settling into his chair across from her. He'd finished the afternoon chores early and found her in the parlor, needles clicking softly as she worked. "It's been years since I tried this," Abby admitted. "My grandmother would probably laugh at how rusty I've gotten." "Looks perfect to me," Silas said, and something in his voice made her look up. His expression was soft, almost tender, as he watched her work. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. "She sounds like she was important to you." Abby smiled, her fingers never pausing in their rhythm. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew," she said. "Lost her husband in the war when my mother was just a baby, but she never remarried, never gave up. Raised my mother and 2 sons on her own, kept the farm running through sheer force of will. She used to say that life would knock you down plenty of times, but getting back up was always a choice." "Sounds like you come by your stubbornness honestly," Silas observed with a hint of teasing. "She taught me to knit when I was 7. Abby continued, ignoring his comment but smiling at it. "Said every woman should know how to make beautiful things, even when the world was ugly, especially when the world was ugly. Wise woman. She was. When I married Thomas, she gave me a hope chest she'd been filling since I was born. Linens and quilts, all made by her own hands. I lost it all when we had to sell the farm." Abby's voice caught slightly at the memory. "I kept thinking about all those hours she'd spent making things for my future, and how that future turned out so differently than either of us had imagined." Silas was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the afternoon light that streamed through the windows. "Maybe that's what you're doing now," he said finally, "making beautiful things for a future that's different than you planned, but still good in its own way." The words settled into the quiet space between them, and Abby felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the grief that had held her heart in such a tight grip for so long. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Silas seemed unusually thoughtful. He moved around the kitchen with his usual efficiency, but she caught him glancing at her frequently, as if he had something on his mind that he couldn't quite bring himself to say. "Out with it," she said finally, setting down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew. "You've been looking like you want to say something all afternoon." Silas paused in his task of slicing bread, his hands stilling on the knife. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what happens after the baby comes." Abby's heart skipped a beat. She'd been trying not to think too far ahead, afraid to make assumptions about their arrangement that might prove wrong. "What about it?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Well, you'll need help for a while, won't you? With the baby and all, and this place." He gestured around the warm kitchen. "It's too big for one person. Too quiet." He was building up to something, and Abby could see the nervousness in the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. "I suppose it might be," she agreed cautiously. "What I'm trying to say is—" Silas set down the knife and turned to face her fully. "What I'm trying to say is that you don't have to leave. After the baby comes, I mean. You could stay if you wanted. Both of you could stay." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to voice. Abby felt her heart begin to race, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Silas," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "about propriety and what people might say. But there are ways to make it respectable. We could." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a plunge into deep water. I could marry you, if you'd have me." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Abby thought she knew about her future. "Marry me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It would solve the practical problems," Silas said quickly, as if afraid she might refuse before he could explain himself. "Give the baby a name and a home, give you security and a place to belong. I know it wouldn't be. I wouldn't expect. It could be a marriage of convenience, if that's what you wanted." But even as he said the words, Abby could see in his eyes that it wouldn't be just convenience for him. Somewhere along the way, this kind, lonely man had begun to care for her as more than just someone who needed his help. "And if it wasn't just convenience," she asked softly, "what then?" Silas's eyes met hers, and she saw the depth of feeling he'd been trying to keep hidden. "Then I'd count myself the luckiest man alive," he said simply. Abby felt tears prick at her eyes, not tears of grief this time, but something warmer, more hopeful. "I need time to think," she said finally. It's a lot to consider." "Of course," Silas agreed quickly. "Take all the time you need. I just wanted you to know that the option was there, that you don't have to face the future alone if you don't want to." That night, Abby lay in bed with her hands resting on her swollen belly, thinking about Silas's proposal. The practical part of her mind catalogued all the advantages: security for her child, a proper home, a man who was kind and reliable and clearly cared for them both. But her heart was more conflicted. She'd loved Thomas with the passionate intensity of youth, and part of her had assumed that kind of love came only once in a lifetime. What she felt for Silas was different, quieter, deeper, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than the quick fire of physical attraction. But maybe that was what love looked like the second time around. Maybe it was less about passion and more about partnership, less about dramatic gestures and more about the steady comfort of knowing someone would be there when you needed them. The baby stirred inside her, and she found herself whispering to the child, as she often did in the quiet hours. "What do you think, little one?" she murmured. "Should we stay here? Should we let this good man take care of us?" As if in response, the baby settled into a more comfortable position, and Abby took it as a sign of approval. She thought about the life they could build together, she and Silas and the child. It wouldn't be the life she'd planned with Thomas, but it could be good in its own way. Silas was a man who would teach her child to ride horses and respect the land, who would be steady and reliable in ways that mattered more than grand romantic gestures. And maybe, if she was very lucky, she could learn to love him the way a woman should love her husband, not as a replacement for what she'd lost, but as something new and valuable in its own right. By morning, she thought she knew what her answer would be, but she wanted to be certain. This decision would affect not just her own future, but the future of her unborn child and the kind, lonely man who'd offered them both a place to belong. As she drifted off to sleep, the yellow blanket folded carefully in the basket beside her bed, Abby found herself imagining a different kind of future than she'd ever dared to hope, for Rhone, where love came not just once, but as many times as a heart was brave enough to open itself to the possibility. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, delivered by young Billy Patterson, who rode out from town with his horse lathered from the hard journey. Abby was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the hoofbeats, and something about the urgency of the rider's approach made her heart skip with dread. Silas emerged from the barn as Billy pulled up to the house, his face flushed and breathing hard. "Mr. McCrae," the boy panted, dismounting quickly, "got a telegram for you from the Western Union office. Man said it was urgent." Silas took the yellow envelope with hands that Abby noticed were not quite steady. Telegrams were rarely bearers of good news, especially ones marked urgent. She moved closer, abandoning the wet sheets in her basket, drawn by an instinct that told her this moment was about to change everything. "Thank you, Billy," Silas said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. "You tell your mother I appreciate you riding out here so quickly." Billy nodded and remounted, but he lingered for a moment, clearly curious about the contents of the message that had seemed important enough to require such haste. Silas waited until the boy was well down the trail before breaking the seal on the envelope. Abby watched his face as he read, saw the color drain from his weathered features and his shoulders sag as if a great weight had settled on them. The telegram fluttered from his fingers to the ground, and she rushed to his side, catching his arm as he swayed slightly. "Silas, what is it? What's wrong?" For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, staring at the paper lying in the dirt, as if it contained words too terrible to comprehend. Then he bent and retrieved it with movements that seemed years older than they had just moments before. "It's David," he said, his voice hollow. "My boy David. There was an accident at the mine outside Denver. Cave-in. He's—" Silas's voice broke completely. "He's gone, Abby. My son is gone." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been thinking about David just the night before, wondering what he'd think of his father's proposal, imagining him visiting the ranch someday with children of his own. Now that future was gone, snuffed out in an instant by tons of rock and earth. "Oh, Silas," she breathed, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched this strong man crumble before her. "Oh, my dear man, I'm so sorry." But Silas seemed not to hear her. He was reading the telegram again, as if hoping the words might change if he looked at them enough times. "It happened 3 days ago," he said dully. 3 days, and I didn't know. I didn't even know my boy was." He couldn't finish the sentence. Abby guided him toward the house, her arm around his waist as he leaned heavily against her. For all his strength, he suddenly seemed fragile, breakable in a way that terrified her. "They've already buried him," Silas continued as they reached the porch. "Michael says they had a service, that there were people there who cared about him. But I wasn't there, Abby. My boy was laid to rest, and his father wasn't there to say goodbye." The next few hours passed in a blur of grief and practical necessities. Abby helped Silas to his chair by the fire and made him tea he didn't drink while he stared into the flames with eyes that seemed to see nothing. She read the telegram herself when he handed it to her with shaking fingers, learning the sparse details of the tragedy that had shattered their world. David had been inspecting a new section of the mine when the supports failed. He died instantly, along with 2 other men, trying to warn the workers deeper in the tunnel. Even in death, he'd been thinking of other fact that seemed to bring Silas no comfort at all. "I should have tried harder," Silas said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. "I should have written more, visited, made more of an effort to bridge the gap between us. Now it's too late. It's too late for everything." "You couldn't have known," Abby said gently, kneeling beside his chair. "You couldn't have known this would happen." But Silas shook his head, his face a mask of self-recrimination. "I wasted 3 years," he said. 3 years of being too proud and too stubborn to reach out properly to my own sons. I got 1 letter to each of them, and now one of them is gone forever. What kind of father does that make me?" Abby felt her heart breaking for him, but also for herself. In the space of a single morning, the future she'd been beginning to imagine had shifted dramatically. The man who'd proposed to her just days ago was now consumed by grief and guilt, and she couldn't help wondering what this tragedy would mean for them. "It makes you human," she said firmly. "It makes you a man who made mistakes, just like every other father who ever lived. David knew you loved him, Silas. That letter you sent told him everything he needed to know about how you felt." "Did it?" Silas's voice was bitter, in a way she'd never heard before. "Because I'll never know for sure now, will I? I'll never get to see him again, never get to meet his children if he'd had them, never get to tell him face to face how sorry I was for the words we exchanged when he left." The baby kicked inside her, a reminder of the life that continued to grow even in the midst of death and sorrow. Abby pressed her hand to her belly, thinking about the child who would soon enter a world where love could be lost in an instant, where words left unsaid could haunt a person forever. "You still have Michael," she said quietly. "You still have 1 son who needs you." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since reading the telegram, and she saw a pain in his eyes that went deeper than grief. It was despair, the kind that came from losing faith in the possibility of happiness. "Do I?" he asked. "Or will I lose him too? Maybe it's better to keep the distance, Abby. Maybe caring too much just makes the pain worse when it all falls apart. The words chilled her more than any winter wind. This was what grief could do to a person, make them so afraid of future loss that they rejected present love. She'd felt it herself after Thomas died, the temptation to close her heart completely rather than risk such devastating pain again. "You don't mean that," she said. "Don't I?" Silas stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the land he'd worked his whole life to build. "Look what caring got me, Abby. I've lost my wife, lost my son, and now I'm sitting here like an old fool, thinking I can start over, thinking I can build something new. Maybe I'm too old for new beginnings. Maybe some things are just meant to stay broken." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air between them. Abby felt a familiar fear rise in her chest, the fear of abandonment, of being left to face an uncertain future alone. But underneath the fear was something stronger, anger at the injustice of it all, and fierce protectiveness for the man she'd come to care about more than she'd realized. "So that's it?" she said, rising to face him. "You're going to let grief make a coward of you? You're going to honor your son's memory by giving up on life, on love, on everything that makes living worthwhile?" Silas turned from the window, his face dark with pain and something that might have been anger. "It's not that simple," he said. "Isn't it?" Abby moved closer, her hands clenched at her sides. "David is gone, and nothing will bring him back. But you're still here, Silas. You're still alive, and you still have people who care about you. Are you going to waste the time you have left being afraid of losing what you've already lost?" For a moment, she thought he might respond with the gentleness she'd grown accustomed to, but instead his expression hardened. "Maybe you should go back to town," he said quietly. "Maybe this arrangement between us was a mistake from the beginning." The words hit her like a slap, but instead of cowering, Abby felt her own strength rise to meet the challenge. "Maybe it was," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "But I'm not going anywhere until after this baby is born. You offered me shelter, and I accepted it in good faith. You don't get to throw me out just because you're hurting." They stared at each other across the suddenly vast space of the parlor. Two people whose grief and fear had built walls between them, just when they needed each other most. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that spring was still far from certain, that winter could return without warning and destroy everything that had seemed to be growing toward the light. That night, they ate dinner in silence, the easy companionship of recent weeks, replaced by a careful politeness that felt worse than outright hostility. Silas retired early, claiming exhaustion, and Abby sat alone by the dying fire, knitting stitches into the yellow blanket and trying not to think about how quickly everything could change. She understood his pain, even understood his retreat into isolation, but she also understood something he seemed to have forgotten, that love wasn't a luxury that could be set aside when times got hard. It was the only thing that made the hard times bearable, the only light that could guide a person through the darkness of loss. As she prepared for bed, Abby made a decision. She wouldn't give up on Silas McCrae, not yet. He'd saved her when she needed saving, and now it was her turn to fight for him even if he was too lost in grief to fight for himself. The labor pains began 3 days later, on a morning when the sky hung low and grey with the promise of another late spring storm. Abby had been restless all night, unable to find a comfortable position, feeling as though something fundamental was shifting inside her body. When the first real contraction gripped her just after dawn, she knew with startling clarity that her time had come. She lay in bed for several minutes, breathing through the pain and trying to gauge how far along she might be. The contractions weren't regular yet, but they were stronger than the practice pains she'd been experiencing for weeks. She had time, but not much. The bitter irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. For 3 days, she and Silas had barely spoken beyond necessity, moving around each other like polite strangers in a house that had once felt like home. His grief had built walls around him that seemed impenetrable, and every attempt she'd made to reach out had been met with cool courtesy that hurt worse than outright anger. Now, Just when she needed him most, she would have to depend on this man who'd made it clear he regretted ever letting her into his life. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she gripped the bedsheets until it passed. There was no denying it now, this baby was coming, whether the world was ready or not. She struggled to her feet and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Silas already dressed and preparing to head out to the barn. He looked up when she appeared, and she saw his eyes take in her pale face and the way she held herself. "It's time," she said simply. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and she saw fear flash across his features. Then the walls went back up, and he nodded with professional efficiency. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked. "Maybe 10 minutes, Abby said. "Sometimes longer." "All right." Silas seemed to be thinking quickly, his rancher's instincts for crisis management taking over. "We have time to prepare, but we need to do it now. I'll get the supplies from the bedroom upstairs, Sarah's things. You should try to eat something if you can. Keep your strength up." The mention of his late wife's birthing supplies sent a chill through Abby. She'd known, intellectually, that Silas had helped deliver his own children. But the reality of depending on his experience gained in happier times with a woman he'd loved without reservation, drove home how alone she really was in this moment. "Silas," she said, as he started toward the stairs. He paused, his hand on the banister. "I know things have been difficult since the telegram," she said carefully, "but I need to know when the time comes. Will you be able to help me? Really help me, not just go through the motions?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, his back still turned to her. "I've never lost a woman in childbirth," he said finally, "and I don't intend to start now." It wasn't the reassurance she'd been hoping for, but it was something. Abby nodded and made her way to the stove, trying to force down some bread and milk while Silas gathered the supplies they would need. The next few hours passed in a haze of increasing discomfort and growing apprehension. The contractions came more frequently, lasting longer each time, and Abby found herself having to stop whatever she was doing to breathe through them. Silas moved around the house with quiet competence, preparing the bedroom, boiling water, laying out clean linens with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done this before. But there was a distance in his manner that frightened her almost as much as the approaching birth. He spoke to her when necessary, helped her walk when the pains made it difficult to move, but there was none of the gentle warmth that had characterized their relationship before David's death. It was as if he'd withdrawn so far into himself that he could only function, not feel. By afternoon, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows and filling the house with the sound of wind and water. Abby lay on the bed in the room that had become hers, trying to find positions that eased the increasingly intense contractions, while Silas sat in the chair beside her, silent and watchful. "Talk to me," she gasped between pains. "Please just talk to me about something. Anything." Silas seemed startled by the request, as if he'd forgotten that she might need comfort as well as medical assistance. "What do you want me to talk about?" he asked. "Your sons," Abby said without thinking, then immediately regretted it when she saw his face close off even further. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "No," Silas said quietly. "It's all right. Maybe it would be good to remember the happy times." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and when he spoke his voice was soft with memory. "When David was born, it was a night a lot like this one," he said. "Sarah had been in labor for nearly 12 hours, and I was terrified something would go wrong. But when he finally came, he was perfect tiny and red and furious at being brought into the world. He had the strongest cry I'd ever heard from a baby." Another contraction gripped Abby, and she rode it out while listening to his voice, finding comfort in the gentle cadence of his words. "Sarah said he was impatient from the very beginning," Silas continued, "always wanting to do things before he was ready, always pushing ahead to the next challenge. When he was 3, I found him trying to saddle one of the horses by himself. The saddle was bigger than he was, but he was determined to figure it out." Despite the pain, Abby found herself almost smiling at the image. Michael was different, Silas went on. Quieter, more thoughtful. He'd watch David's adventures and learn from his mistakes instead of making his own. Sarah used to say Michael had an old soul, that he understood things most children couldn't grasp. The contractions were coming faster now, barely giving Abby time to catch her breath between them. Silas moved closer, his experienced hands checking her progress with gentle efficiency. "It won't be long now," he said, and for the first time since David's death, she heard genuine warmth in his voice. "You're doing fine, Abby. Better than fine." As if summoned by his words, the most intense contraction yet seized her, and Abby cried out, despite her efforts to stay quiet. When it passed, she was breathing hard and gripping the sheet so tightly her knuckles were white. "I can't do this," she gasped. "Silas, I can't. Something's wrong. It hurts too much." "Hey!" Silas's voice was suddenly firm, commanding her attention. "Look at me, Abby. Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes, and what she saw there surprised her. The walls he'd built around himself were still there, but behind them she could see the man she'd come to care for, steady, reliable, refusing to let her face this alone. "You can do this," he said with absolute conviction. "I've seen you split wood in freezing cold when you could barely stand. I've watched you hold your head high when the world tried to knock you down. You're one of the strongest women I've ever known, and you can do this." Another contraction built, and this time Abby held onto his words like a lifeline, using his faith in her strength to find her own courage. "That's it," Silas encouraged. "Just like that. You're almost there." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was reflecting the struggle taking place in the small bedroom. Lightning illuminated the windows in brief, stark flashes, and thunder rolled across the sky like the sound of heaven's own labor pains. "Silas," Abby said during a brief respite between contractions, "if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," he interrupted firmly. "But if it does," she persisted, "promise me you'll take care of the baby. Promise me you won't let grief make you turn away from an innocent child." Silas was quiet for a moment, his hands busy with preparations she couldn't see. "I promise," he said finally, "but you're going to be here to take care of your baby yourself. Both of you are going to be fine." The next contraction brought with it an overwhelming urge to push, and Abby knew they'd reached the crucial moment. Everything that had led to this Thomas's death, her journey to Dust Creek, meeting Silas, the slow building of trust and affection between them had brought her to this point where new life would enter the world. "I can see the head," Silas said, his voice tight with concentration. "Just a little more, Abby. You're almost there." From somewhere deep inside herself, Abby found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. The pain was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, fierce, primal determination to bring this child safely into the world, no matter what it cost her. "One more," Silas said urgently. "One more push, and we'll have our baby." Our baby. The words registered somewhere in the back of Abby's mind, even through the haze of effort and pain. He'd said our baby, as if this child already belonged to both of them. With a final, tremendous effort that seemed to pull strength from every fiber of her being, Abby pushed with everything she had. For a moment, the world seemed to hang, suspended the storm outside, the lamplight flickering on the walls, Silas's steady breathing, her own thundering heartbeat. And then, sudden and miraculous as dawn after the longest night, she felt the child slip free from her body and into Silas's waiting hands. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. No cry, no movement, just the sound of rain against glass and her own labored breathing. Terror gripped Abby's heart as she struggled to sit up, desperate to see her child. "Silas," she whispered, "is the baby?" But even as she spoke, a thin, indignant wail filled the room, and Abby felt tears of relief stream down her face. Silas was bent over the tiny form, working quickly with the same careful competence he brought to everything, and when he finally turned toward her, his face was transformed. "It's a girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A perfect, beautiful little girl." He placed the baby on Abby's chest, and she looked down into the small red face of her daughter, Thomas's daughter, but also somehow theirs, born into this strange new family they'd created out of loneliness and loss, and the gradual recognition that some kinds of love were worth the risk of pain. "Hello, little one," Abby whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Welcome to the world." As Silas worked to complete the birth and tend to both mother and child, Abby saw something in his face that gave her hope. The walls were still there, the grief still raw and painful, but underneath it all was wonder, the ancient, powerful wonder of new life coming into the world, of hope persisting even in the darkest times. Outside, the storm began to ease, and the first tentative rays of evening sun broke through the clouds, filling the room with golden light. It felt like a benediction, a promise that even though the world was full of loss and sorrow, it was also full of miraculous small, crying miracles that arrived when they were needed most. The hours immediately following the birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Abby held her daughter close, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and the way the baby's dark eyes seemed to take in everything around her with solemn curiosity. The child was smaller than she'd expected, but clearly healthy, with strong lungs and an imperious cry that left no doubt about her opinions. Silas moved around the room with quiet efficiency, cleaning up the aftermath of birth, with the same careful attention he gave to everything. But Abby could see the change in him. Something had shifted during those intense hours of labor. Some wall had cracked, if not fallen entirely. "She's beautiful," he said softly, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Looks like she has your stubbornness already." "How can you tell?" Abby asked, smoothing the baby's dark hair. "The way she's looking at me," Silas replied with the ghost of a smile. "Like she's already sizing up the situation and making plans." The baby chose that moment to let out a particularly indignant wail, as if protesting being discussed like she wasn't there. Abby laughed despite her exhaustion, a sound that felt rusty from disuse but genuine. "I think you might be right," she said. "She definitely has opinions." "Have you thought about what to call her?" Silas asked. Abby had been avoiding thinking too far ahead, but looking down at her daughter's face, she felt a sudden certainty. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Silas was quiet for a moment, considering the name. "Hope McCrae," he said softly, testing how it sounded. "Carter," Abby corrected automatically, then caught herself. "Hope Carter." Something flickered across Silas's face, hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but he nodded. "Hope Carter," he repeated. "It's a good name, a strong name." The baby had quieted in Abby's arms, and she found herself studying the tiny face, looking for traces of Thomas in the delicate features. But what she saw was something entirely new. Not Thomas, not herself, but this small person who was completely her own individual. "You know," Silas said carefully, "my offer still stands, about making things legal between us. It would give her a father's name, a secure future." Abby looked up at him, seeing the uncertainty in his expression. 3 days ago, before David's death, she'd been leaning toward saying yes to his proposal. But everything had changed with that telegram, and she wasn't sure where they stood anymore. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Still, after everything that's happened?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the baby in her arms. "I don't know what I want anymore," he said honestly. "I thought I did, but then—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "But then you remembered that caring about people means risking losing them," Abby said gently. "Yes." The word came out rough, painful. "I buried my wife, Abby. Now I've lost one of my sons. How much loss is one man supposed to bear?" "I don't know," Abby replied. "But I know that the alternative, closing your heart completely, isn't really living. It's just existing." Baby Hope stirred restlessly, making the small sounds that indicated she was working up to another crying session. Abby adjusted her position, trying to soothe the child, but her inexperience showed in the awkward way she held the baby. "Here," Silas said, standing up. "May I?" Abby hesitated for just a moment before carefully transferring Hope to his arms. The baby looked impossibly small against his broad chest, but his hands were sure and gentle as he cradled her. Almost immediately, Hope settled, her fussing subsiding into occasional small sounds of contentment. "You're good with her," Abby observed. "It comes back to you," Silas said, his voice soft with memory. "I used to walk the floor with Michael when he had colic. Sarah would be exhausted from nursing, and I'd take him for hours sometimes, just walking and talking to him until he'd finally settle." There was pain in his voice when he mentioned Sarah, but also warmth, the first genuine warmth Abby had heard from him since the telegram arrived. "She would have loved this," Silas continued, looking down at Hope. "Sarah always said this house needed more children in it. She wanted a house full of boys and girls running through the rooms, filling the place with noise and laughter." "Why didn't you have more?" Abby asked gently. "We tried," Silas said simply. "Lost 3 babies before they could draw breath. After the last one, Sarah said maybe God thought 2 boys were enough for us. But I always wondered if she was just protecting herself from hoping too much." The revelation hit Abby with unexpected force. She'd assumed that Sarah had simply been content with 2 children, but the reality was so much more painful years of hope and loss, of dreams that never came to pass. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "No reason you should have," Silas replied. "It was a long time ago, and we learned to be grateful for what we had instead of mourning what we didn't." Hope had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny face peaceful in the lamplight. Silas looked down at her with an expression that was impossible to read wonder, certainly, but also something that might have been longing. "She's lucky to have you for a mother," he said quietly. "You're going to give her everything she needs. Strength, independence, the knowledge that she can face whatever life throws at her." "What about love?" Abby asked. "What about family, a sense of belonging somewhere?" Silas met her eyes across the small space between them. "She'll have that too," he said. "Whether you marry me or not, this will always be her home if she needs it. I give you my word on that." The promise hung in the air between them, and Abby felt something loosen in her chest, a fear she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Whatever happened between her and Silas, her daughter would be cared for. Hope would never face the world entirely alone. "Thank you," she whispered. As if sensing the weight of the moment, Hope chose that instant to wake up with a lusty cry that demanded immediate attention. Silas chuckled, the first real laugh Abby had heard from him in days. "I think someone's hungry," he said, carefully transferring the baby back to Abby's arms. "I'll give you some privacy." But as he reached the door, Abby called his name. "Silas, whatever I decide about your proposal, I want you to know that these months here, they've meant more to me than I can say. You saved me when I needed saving, and I won't forget that." He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. "You saved me too," he said quietly. "Maybe not in the way either of us expected, but you did. Both of you did." After he left, Abby settled back against the pillows with Hope nursing contentedly at her breast. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the world outside clean and fresh-washed. Through the window, she could see the first stars appearing in the clearing sky, and she found herself thinking about the future, not just the immediate concerns of caring for a newborn, but the larger questions about what kind of life she wanted to build for herself and her daughter. The yellow blanket she'd knitted lay folded at the foot of the bed, ready to wrap around Hope when feeding time was over. Looking at it, Abby remembered her grandmother's words about making beautiful things, even when the world was ugly. Maybe that was what she and Silas had been doing all along, taking the ugly realities of loss and loneliness and weaving them into something that could become beautiful, given time and care. Hope finished nursing and fell asleep again, and Abby wrapped her carefully in the soft yellow wool. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the practical concerns of caring for a newborn, the need to make decisions about the future, the delicate work of rebuilding whatever it was that existed between her and Silas. But tonight, it was enough to hold her daughter close and listen to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Abby felt genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The sound that woke Abby wasn't Hope's crying, though the baby was indeed fussing in her basket beside the bed. It was something else, raw, broken sound that took her sleep-fogged mind a moment to identify. When she realized what she was hearing, her heart clenched with sympathy and concern. Silas was crying. The sound was coming from somewhere else in the house, muffled but unmistakable. Abby had never heard a man cry like that, not the quiet tears she'd seen him shed when reading his son's letter, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside. Hope's fussing grew more insistent, and Abby carefully lifted her daughter from the basket, settling her to nurse while straining to hear more. The crying had stopped, but she could hear movement, footsteps pacing back and forth, the creak of floorboards under restless feet. When Hope had finished eating and drifted back to sleep, Abby wrapped herself in her robe and made her way quietly through the house. She found Silas in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his head in his hands and an open bottle of whiskey beside him. He looked up when she appeared, and she saw that his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "Did I wake you? I tried to be quiet, but—" "You don't need to apologize," Abby said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "What's wrong? Besides the obvious, I mean." Silas let out a bitter laugh that held no humor at all. "I was thinking about David," he said. "About the day he was born, how proud I was, how certain I was that I'd be a good father to him. And then I started thinking about all the ways I failed him, all the chances I had to be better and didn't take." He reached for the whiskey bottle, but Abby's hand intercepted his, covering his fingers with her own. "You weren't a perfect father," she said quietly, "but you weren't a failure either. David knew you loved him, that letter proved it." "Did it?" Silas's voice was raw with pain. "Because all I can think about is the last conversation we had, the things I said to him when he told me he was leaving. I called him ungrateful, said he was throwing away everything I'd worked to build. I told him if he walked away from the ranch, he shouldn't bother coming back." Abby felt her heart break for him. No wonder he'd been so afraid to open his son's letter. She'd been carrying this guilt for 3 years, convinced he'd driven them away with his own harsh words. "You were hurt," she said. "You were watching your children leave, and you reacted from pain. That's human, Silas. That's not unforgivable." "Isn't it?" He pulled his hand away from hers and scrubbed his face roughly. "He wanted to go to college, you know. Had dreams of being an engineer, building bridges and railways. But I needed help on the ranch, and I convinced him to stay, told him education was fine for other people's sons, but he had responsibilities here." "You needed his help," Abby said. "I needed him to want to stay," Silas corrected. "I needed him to choose this life, this place, me, over everything else the world had to offer. And when he finally got old enough to make his own choice, I couldn't accept it." He stood abruptly and began pacing the small kitchen, his movements agitated and restless. "I held on to him too tight, and then when he pulled away, I let pride keep me from going after him. Sarah would have known what to dosh, always knew how to balance holding on and letting go. But I never learned that skill." Abby watched him pace, this strong man who'd seemed so steady and reliable, now revealed in all his human frailty. She thought about her own mistakes, her own regrets, and realized that maybe the difference between them wasn't that she was wiser or better, but simply that she'd been forced to confront her limitations sooner. "Silas," she said softly, "come sit down." Something in her tone made him stop pacing and look at her. After a moment's hesitation, he returned to his chair, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and grief. "Do you remember what you told me about your sons when I first came here?" Abby asked. "You said they were full of life and energy, that this house used to ring with their laughter. You said they were beautiful boys." "They were," Silas said quietly. "That's what David was when he died," Abby continued. "Not the angry young man who fought with his father and stormed out 3 years ago. He was a man who'd built a life he was proud of, who'd found work he loved, who died trying to save other people. That's the legacy of his childhood, Silas. That's what you and Sarah gave him." Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "I failed him," he said finally, but there was less conviction in his voice now. You loved him imperfectly, Abby corrected. The same way every parent loves their children. The same way my father loved me, despite his mistakes. The same way I'll probably love Hope, despite all the mistakes I'm bound to make. What if I can't do this again? Silas asked suddenly. What if I can't risk caring that much about another child, another family? What if losing David broke something in me that can't be fixed? The question hung in the air between them, and Abby understood that this was the real issue, just grief over his son's death, but terror at the thought of opening his heart again, only to face future loss. Then you'll live a very safe, very empty life, she said honestly, and Hope will grow up without ever knowing what it's like to have a father who loves her enough to risk being hurt. The baby's cry drifted from the bedroom, and Abby started to rise, but Silas gestured for her to stay. I'll get her, he said. You rest. She heard him moving carefully through the house, heard his voice murmuring something soft and soothing. When he returned, Hope was quiet in his arms, looking up at him with that solemn baby gaze that seemed to see straight through to the soul. She's not afraid of me, he said with wonder. Despite everything, my grief, my anger, my fear, she's not afraid. Babies are good judges of character, Abby said. They can sense when someone has a good heart, even when that person has forgotten it themselves. Silas looked down at Hope, and Abby saw something shift in his expression, the walls he'd built around himself cracking just a little wider. I want to try, he said quietly. I want to try to be the man you and Hope deserve. But I'm scared, Abby. I'm more scared than I've ever been in my life. Good, Abby said, surprising him. Being scared means you understand what you're risking. It means you know how precious this is. She stood and moved to his side, placing her hand on his shoulder as he held her daughter. We're all scared, she continued. I'm terrified of being a mother, of making the wrong choices, of not being enough for her. But fear doesn't have to be the thing that stops use. It can be the thing that makes us try harder, love more carefully, hold on more gently. Silas looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the man she'd fallen in love with, not the broken, grieving stranger of the past few days, but the steady, kind soul who'd offered her shelter when she needed it most. Will you marry me? He asked quietly. Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I love you, and I want to build a family with you and Hope. Because I want to try to be the husband and father you both deserve. Abby felt tears spring to her, eyes not tears of sadness this time, but tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming gratitude that comes when hope is answered with hope. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Hope chose that moment to let out a small, contented sigh, as if giving her approval to the arrangement. And for the first time since David's death, Silas smiled, really smiled, with genuine happiness lighting his eyes. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of hope that came from choosing love despite the risks. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning when the cottonwoods were dressed in gold and the air carried the promise of winter, Abby stood in the barn watching Silas teach Hope to ride one of the gentler mares. At 6 months old, Hope was too young for actual riding, of course, but Silas held her securely in front of him on the saddle while the horse walked in slow, careful circles around the corral. The baby's delighted squeals echoed off the barn walls, and Abby found herself smiling at the pure joy on both their faces. Silas had taken to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, but there was nothing quiet about the love that shone in his eyes whenever he looked at Hope. They'd been married in May, a simple ceremony in the parlor, with only old Pete from town as witness. Abby had worn her best dress, not white, because that seemed inappropriate for a widow with a baby, but a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Silas had surprised her with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, delicate gold set with a small but perfect sapphire. Something blue, he'd said when he slipped it onto her finger, and she'd laughed through her tears at his unexpected attention to tradition. The month since then had been a careful dance of building something new while honoring what had come before. They'd moved Abby's few belongings into the master bedroom, but by mutual agreement, Sarah's photographs remained on the mantelpiece alongside a new one of Hope taken on her blessing day. The past wasn't something to be erased, but rather something to be woven into the fabric of their new life together. Michael had written from San Francisco, expressing delight at his father's remarriage and asking permission to visit with his new wife during the Christmas season. The letter had brought tears to Silas's eyes-happy tears this time, the kind that came from bridges rebuilt and relationships mended. He says Catherine is eager to meet his new sister. Silas had told Abby after reading the letter aloud. Says he's always wanted siblings closer to his own age, and a baby sister is almost as good. Now, watching him with Hope, Abby marveled at how much had changed since that snowy day when he'd found her collapsed behind Murphy's store. The woman who'd been so afraid of accepting help, so determined to prove her independence, had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was open your heart to the possibility of love. "How are my girls doing?" Silas called from the corral, guiding the horse toward where Abby stood. "Watching my husband spoil our daughter," Abby replied, though her tone was fond rather than critical. "Our daughter," Silas repeated, as if testing the words. Even after 6 months of marriage, he sometimes seemed amazed that Hope was legally his, that he had the right to claim her as family. He brought the horse to a stop and carefully handed Hope down to Abby, who wrapped the baby in the yellow blanket that had become her favorite. The blanket was showing signs of wear, now pulled threads where tiny fingers had grabbed at it, faded spots where it had been washed countless times, but it remained soft and warm, a tangible reminder of the hope that had sustained Abby through her darkest days. "I have something for you," Silas said as they walked back toward the house, "an early Christmas present, you might say." From his jacket pocket, he pulled an official-looking document, and Abby's breath caught when she saw what it was, new deed to the ranch, made out to both their names. "Silas," she breathed, "you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "This is your home now, yours and Hope's. It should be official, legal, permanent. No matter what happens, you'll always belong here." Abby felt tears prick at her eyes as she studied the document. Her name, Abigail Carter, written in careful script alongside his, making their partnership official in the eyes of the law as well as in their hearts. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying all the weight of gratitude and affection and deep, abiding trust that had grown between them. "I love you too," Silas replied, wrapping his free arm around her waist as they reached the porch. "Both of you, more than I ever thought I'd be brave enough to love anyone again." Inside the warm kitchen, they settled into the routine that had become as natural as breathing. Silas stoked the fire, while Abby prepared Hope's feeding, and they moved around each other with the easy choreography of a couple who'd learned to share space and responsibilities. As Hope nursed contentedly in her arms, Abby looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. The big table where they shared meals and conversations, the stove where Silas made his terrible coffee that she'd learned to love anyway, the windows that looked out over the land, they now owned together all of it, felt solid, permanent, like something that could weather whatever storms life might bring. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Giving up your independence, tying yourself to this place, to me?" Abby considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman she'd been when she first arrived in Dust Creek, proud, stubborn, determined to need no one and nothing except her own strength. "No," she said finally. "I thought independence meant never needing anyone, never depending on anyone for anything. But I was wrong. Real independence is knowing you can stand on your own if you have to, but choosing to stand with someone else because it makes you both stronger." Hope had fallen asleep in her arms, and Abby carefully transferred her to the basket they kept in the kitchen for just this purpose. The baby settled with a small sigh, one tiny fist curled against her cheek, completely secure in the knowledge that she was safe and loved. "She's going to be beautiful," Silas said softly, looking down at his sleeping daughter. She's going to be strong, Abby corrected, beautiful and strong and sure of her place in the world. As if in response to their voices, Hope's eyes fluttered open, and she gazed up at them with that solemn baby stare that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. She was developing her own personality, now curious, determined, with a laugh that could light up a room and a cry that left no doubt about her displeasure when things weren't to her liking. "She has your eyes," Silas observed, "and your stubborn chin." "She has your gentleness," Abby replied. "The way you hold her, talk to Hirsch, knows she's safe with you." They stood there for a moment, the three of them, surrounded by the warmth and golden light of late afternoon. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of winter, but inside all was peace and contentment. Later that evening, after Hope had been fed and bathed and settled for the night, Abby and Silas sat by the fire, as had become their custom. But instead of reading or knitting, they simply held each other, finding comfort in the simple pleasure of shared silence. "I keep thinking about that first night," Abby said quietly. "When you brought me here through the storm, I was so afraid of accepting help, so convinced that needing someone else made me weak." "And now?" Silas asked. "Now, I think the bravest thing I ever did was let you take care of me," she replied. "And the luckiest thing that ever happened to me was finding someone who needed taking care of too." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the world in white and settling soft and silent on the windows. But inside the Double S Ranch, three hearts beat in quiet harmony, and the future stretched ahead, full of promise and hope, and the deep, abiding love that comes from choosing family not because you have to, but because you want to. As Abby drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, her last conscious thought was that sometimes the end of one story was really just the beginning of another, and this new story, written by two people who'd learned that healing wasn't always a solitary journey, was going to be beautiful.